Psychologists on Reddit. What made you realize you were treating a psychopath? Story 1. Clinical psychologist here. At first I didn't know. If anything, given the context, he was more put together than most of my patients. The subject of his criminal past came up. I only knew he had served prison time some years before, but not what he was in for. I had met with him a month or two when this came up. Turns out it was 2 separate sentences served. Both were for assault. In both cases, he was the exact thing we are afraid of. A guy lurking in a dark alley jumping a drunk girl. He told me about these things as if he was talking about the weather. When it dawned on me that he expressed absolutely no remorse or guilt, I got the same cold, gut-wrenching kind of primal fear you feel when you're out for a walk and almost step on a snake. Story 2. I am a mental health professional working in corrections, max security facility. In my experience, psychopaths will have this predatory stare, especially when they're trying to manipulate you. It is completely unnerving and hard to describe to someone unfamiliar with this population. They also tend to be narcissistic and overly charming, making a point to be overly friendly with you. I know this look. I knew a dealer and he had this look to him. He would smile and try to be charming and engaging, but his eyes said something else. Usually when people smile, like a real smile, their eyes seem to have life and joy, but his seemed almost dead inside, almost like snake eyes. He would try every trick to get you to like him, but something always seemed off. Adding to that, he always tried to do something sort of pushy to get his way, like asking for hugs and trying to force it, even if I'd say no. It was always very subtle and calculated. I think the eyes are always the most telling when you meet someone like that. They always seem dead and cold inside, even if they try their hardest to seem normal. Story 3. Current psychologist working in a prison here. I've worked with 3 individuals I dare say would have met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder within the last 2 weeks. One commonality is that they use behaviors as tools to benefit only themselves. Self-harm not because they wish to hurt themselves, but to use it as a tool to lure staff into the cell to incite violence and gain extra medication or be sent to the SHU, which comes with a status. Story 4. Often there is a particular face they make when they are relating a story, usually about how clever they are. One of the TED Talks on how to spot a liar calls it duping delight. Sometimes they can't contain their rage, and you see them switch. Edit. Last sentence is a personal observation, not related to the TED Talk. Edit. To add link. We had to watch it for our criminology class. As other posters have noted, there is no evidence-based way to spot a liar. I just found the duping delight fascinating. I also see it in the faces of my young niece and nephew at times. Story 5. The eyes when they believe they're supposed to be putting on an emotion. You have to understand, it's going ouch when you bang your funny bone, even though it doesn't hurt, because all your life people have cried out in pain when they've banged their elbow. You meet enough people like that, and you find yourself hating any obligatory situation in your life when you have to lie, like being asked how you are and saying good when you're actually not, simply because all you can associate it with is them. Story 6. When describing some of the awful things he had done to people, he didn't express remorse, regret, or even anger. He expressed disdain. He was disdainful of people that he had irreparably harmed because he didn't get enough out of it. He used them for his own ends, and he genuinely believed that they had failed him. Story 7. I typed out a long response to this, but then deleted it because I couldn't really describe it without giving too many details away. One thing I will say is that psychopaths aren't all your classic murderous criminals. Sometimes the nicest people you'll meet are psychopaths, and it's all an act to manipulate you to do what they want, or think a certain way about them, because that makes them feel like they've won and or are superior to you. Watch out for the nice guys. Story 8. So after reading a lot of these, it's worth mentioning the following. Psychologists rarely even use the term psychopath anymore. Those disorders which would fall under the umbrella of psychopathy are preferred to the otherwise generic and easily confused term of psychopath. Note how many people frequently conflate psychopathy with narcissism. There's a narcissism personality disorder which fits many models of psychopathy, but not all so-called psychopaths are narcissists. It often doesn't take training in psychology to spot so-called psychopaths. Formal training is needed to diagnose and treat it, but our brains are highly tuned to pick up on small things that our higher consciousness is often otherwise unaware of. This isn't to say that we should purely trust our gut. We're more often wrong than we'd like to admit. But how we feel about our first impressions is often very important. Far more people exhibit features of various psychopathic personality disorders than most realize. The vast majority of these people, however, live fairly ordinary, productive lives and don't exhibit violent tendencies. It's even been argued that psychopaths are an important evolutionary element, giving us people who can detach themselves from the human experience in order to provide valuable insights or behaviors the rest of us couldn't fathom. Most of us will go through periods in our lives in which we often exhibit many symptoms of a personality disorder, but these are merely moments. They don't truly impact our lives in the way that a true disorder does. Story 9. Not a psychologist, but a counselor. They were talking about a disagreement they'd had with their partner, an accidental spillage of water onto some electronics. It could honestly happen to anyone. As calmly as if he was describing, I don't know, changing a channel, he started saying how he pinned his partner up against the wall and started trying to strangle her. No emotion, no change of tone, just as if it were a normal thing. I was a trainee at the time and not qualified to deal with domestic violence. Needless to say, I transferred the client to another therapist. However, I was not allowed to end the session and had to sit with him for another 20 minutes. I've never been so scared in my life. I felt like a small prey animal trapped in the room with a predator. He just didn't care. However, if you met him, you'd think he was just a normal, successful, kind of average dude. I am 99% sure he was a sociopath, because he kept trying to get certain reactions out of me, kept changing his tactics, kept trying to charm me, and when I wouldn't rise to it, he became weirdly and coldly irritated. I've never had a client like him before or since. Story 10. Not a psychologist, but from my experience of dating a psychopath. Didn't know until years in. A lot of what appears as emotion is simply mirroring emotions they see others exhibit, and how they believe is the socially appropriate way to respond, whether or not they actually feel that way. This is how they blend in and appear normal to the average person. They are narcissistic, and everything revolves around them. They are always able to place blame on other people. Nothing is ever their fault. However, anything positive in their lives or others' lives is because of them. Because they are narcissists, they believe they are much more important than they actually are. They have strong influence over others because of their ability to feel nothing when manipulating others. And this is how they exert control over others. They will do whatever it takes in order to come out on top of a situation with no actual regard for others' lives or feelings. They may fake their feelings or reactions to continue to manipulate those around them, and they get pleasure over having control over other people and feeling like they're pulling all the strings. Story 11. Therapist here. A good sociopath will, on the surface, seem totally invested in treatment. They kind of schmooze you and try to impress you. Then eventually you catch on that they're manipulating you to think one way while they're totally thinking and behaving the opposite of what you think. Also, if you're an empath and really pick up on people's moods or their vibes, sociopaths and psychopaths just give you a big gut feeling that something isn't right. You almost feel slimy after talking to them. That's my experience anyway. Story 12. I had one, and it was so bizarre and haunting. I was doing a psych evaluation on a tween. I think he was about 12, and was in the early stage of doing the clinical interview with him and his mother. The mother described various acts of violence the child had done, in addition to other things, and I listened to the child's explanations of why. After I walked them out of the office, I remember talking to a colleague that this was the first time I had ever encountered a sociopath in the making. Story 13. Psychology student here. I got the chance to sit in on the interrogation, on a monitor in the other room, of this guy who was clearly off. He seemed like a normal enough guy, cracked a joke about the bland room and sat down, smiling like how politicians do. Just that fake but somehow authentic smile. I thought he was really actually innocent at first because most people I've seen interrogated who are guilty are really quiet, shy, and nervous. But he was confident and relaxed. To make a long story short, he was a 20-some-year-old who shoved his mother into the corner of a wall, her head cracked open, and he watched. Through the whole interrogation, he was laughing and smiling. You could clearly tell he felt no emotional connection to his own mother and had no guilt about anything he'd done. Story 14. I'm not sure if he was a confirmed psychopath. I didn't interact with him long enough to find out for sure. I was introduced to G at a party. He was dating a friend of mine who I went to uni with, who we'll call M. I hadn't seen her for a while. We were both good friends with another friend, A. A was hosting a party and M and G were there. I was introduced to G, and as soon as I went to shake his hand and made eye contact, I knew something wasn't right. I felt the hair on the nape of my neck stand up, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes. I heard a little voice in the back of my head telling me to run for the hills. I met him a few times after that, and each time my lizard brain was internally screaming at me. I was on edge the whole time. I heard through A over the course of the next 6 months about how G was manipulative, controlling, and vindictive towards M, and A was seeing less and less of M. A initially tried to reassure me that I was exaggerating and making it up, when I confessed I didn't like him right off the bat. Slowly, she conceded that, okay, maybe G was on the spectrum or something. Eventually, she agreed that he was manipulative, but never met me as a psychopath. Either way, A and I both assisted M in leaving the relationship. She was a live-in girlfriend towards the end, and she's now happily single. A freaky nightmare for her, but a happy ending. She's had some counseling and we've closed ranks around her, but she is now happy. Sort of, that she's been through it because she feels she's less naive about the world. Story 15. Not my story, but a friend's who works in a criminal psychiatric facility. He had 2 days a week with an inmate there to see if he was holding up. He was in there for an unprovoked, rather brutal assault for 2 years, I think. A few months in, my friend brought up the assault and wanted to talk about the motivation behind it. His answer? Oh, this guy was walking with this gorgeous girl that I winked to, and she ignored me. So I decided I should show her there are consequences for her disrespect. Story 16. I remember a resident I worked with when I used to work one of the orderly positions during the evening shift at a facility for kids and adolescents with special needs and mental health conditions near Chicago. This resident was a young man in his early 20s who I had worked with a lot. For the most part, I actually got along with him really well, and he usually seemed to show affection towards others. However, I had been warned by experienced staff to be careful near him, as he is very strong and used to suffer from delusions. Despite the claims, he was always friendly towards me, possibly since we both had very similar hobbies, and I liked science fiction. But one day, as I came into work for the evening shift, I saw the staff who usually worked with him in the mornings, and his shirt had blood all over it. I was told that during school, when his staff was telling him to be more appropriate, the resident had gotten up and started punching the staff in the face, and even started beating him with items he could grab. I cannot comment on the incident, as I did not see it, but I had seen the resident over time afterwards, and his sense of empathy was odd. He knew that what he did was wrong and that other kids were now scared of him as a result of his actions, but he didn't seem to have strong feelings about the day himself. It's not that he was emotionally disconnected, because he did try to get along with most people and aimed at being more positive. In all honesty, his incidents were uncommon and possible, but still difficult to maintain. He was usually easy to approach and did well in the classes he took, and while he was there, he had struggled with his emotions, as he was both in a residential facility and coping with the loss of family members at the same time. I learned that he got arrested years after he aged out of the facility for attacking a care worker at a group home. I do miss my conversations with him, and I hope he gets a chance to turn things around. But I know that his mental condition while being in the jail system stops that ideal dead in its tracks. Story 17. Just watch The Sopranos. Spoilers. The main character, Tony Soprano, is in therapy up until the second to last episode. He goes through major psychological arcs that play out every season and in smaller episodic fashion. These build up upon each other, until we start to see Tony spinning his wheels. Problems begin to recur when he seemingly moved past them in previous seasons. His psychologist is given a heads up on research about sociopaths, how they can use psychology sessions as a tool, and how they will never make progress. This explains why in the final season we see Tony spin his wheels over and over. Tony's been using psychological tricks learned in his therapy sessions on his opponents and human obstacles throughout the entire series and has not been making any progress. Story 18. I'm going to get buried. As a social worker, I was talking to a guy with diagnosed antisocial personality disorder. It wasn't so much the lack of empathy as it was the way he was running in circles around questions. If I brought up his use, he brought up his car accident. Very obviously manipulative, trying to create multiple sob stories about how he was the victim in every circumstance, including multiple assaults he had committed. About a year later, that R. Kelly Gayle King interview came out, and the similarities I saw in my client with R. Kelly was shocking. Story 19. I worked with someone who was once well known. His sidekick, as we grew to call him, was void of soul. You could look at his eyes, and it was blackness staring back at you, an emptiness I've seen in the eyes of known serial killers. And when you were near him, you could almost feel a vibration of evil. It was almost like watching a mime when he was forced to interact with others. Exaggerated facial expressions, often mimicking the person speaking to him. And when they walked away, his face clicked off like a TV set, tuned to static. There's more there, but I'm not going to say. Story 20. Psychopaths are super common. Athletes and highly successful businessmen, for example, tend to score pretty high in testing. Likewise, so do I. It does not mean I'm a crazy murderer. I do have to keep myself in check a lot though. Super impulsive, competitive, etc. I've actually benefited from the personality traits associated with it more so than not. Then again, it's also got me into a lot of trouble. I have pretty much zero regrets and not at all interested in things like long-term relationships or starting a family. I don't like watching channels like CI though. Too many similar comparisons that make me feel yuck. Story 21. The first one I encountered during my internship as a forensic psychologist. I noticed nausea coming up, but I suppressed it because I was so focused on observing. The man said things like he didn't really know what to do after banging his ex's brain in with a vase. So he sat on the couch and started smoking a joint. But then his dog wouldn't stop whining because he couldn't stand the sight of his owner laying there, so he covered her with a tarp and took a nap. Instincts. They're real, dudes. Story 22. The best way to find a psychopath is that they say everything right. My father has worked with many that knew exactly how to make you believe that they're doing better and genuinely believes you're making a difference in his life. He's very intelligent and sees right through it, often kicking them out of his office. Ladies, if some guy comes up to you and says everything perfectly without anything awkward or weird, run. Story 23. Training psych students here, so I don't have any specific real-life people, but I do have a case we looked at for research purposes that was pretty grueling. A 17-year-old boy was convicted of arson and double homicide from setting a house on fire. The victims inside were his parents, who were on the second floor. He had started the fire downstairs in their living room and had made sure to gas the front and back doors before exiting through a window. When he was taken into custody, he showed absolutely no emotions, other than a disdain for the sound of the radio in the police car. Other than that, he held normal conversations about girls and video games, as if he hadn't just burned his parents alive. When he was questioned, he, in detail, explained that he had slowly siphoned gasoline from both parents' cars over the course of a few months. He didn't have a job or his own car, so he had no other method to acquire it without seeming suspicious. His parents never noticed the subtle losses in gas in their cars, and went about life normally. He stated that he went about committing the arson as if he were making breakfast. The casual demeanor of his words was described as unnerving and unsettling. At the end of questioning, he asked if their had been recovered and asked if he could see them because he wanted to know what they looked like after burning. Pretty jostling stuff in this world.